So the perception among voters is that the economy is influenced largely or maybe totally by whomever is president at the time. Is that true?
Well, just look at the conversation around gas prices. Presidents love to claim credit when gas prices are low. They love to say it's not my fault when gas prices are high. Gas prices are a function of oil prices. Oil prices are determined on a global market. And so consumers will say, well, we must be producing less oil because gas prices are higher. And yet, if you look at the data, the U.S. is actually producing a record amount of oil in 2024. We've actually increased oil and natural gas production over the last 4 years. But because of global conditions, the price of crude is higher, and thus gas prices are higher. We also have a refinery constraint. We can pump as much oil as we want, but if you can't get it through the refinery system, it doesn't mean that gas prices are going to be lower. And whether or not they say that's because of the president or not because of the president is another story.
Mm-hmm. Some people understand that it's global factors, and they will say, well, it's because of what's happening with Russia and Ukraine, and the United States needs to isolate from that, and that would also protect us from these inflationary factors. Do you think that's the case?
Russia's invasion of Ukraine is tightly tied with U.S. national security policy. This is not something that is happening within a vacuum. We have seen Russia's encroachment in Georgia, and we've seen its meddling in politics in the United States and also in Europe. And if you talk to our allies in the Baltics, or if you talk to our ally in Poland, they would say a very simple thing. If we abandon Ukraine, we're next. And if you think commodity prices are uncertain now, imagine what would happen if Russia controlled Ukraine and then made moves on the Baltics or Poland. That would be a much wider geopolitical conflict, which would create significant instability in commodities prices globally. It is in our national security interest, in my opinion, to provide aid to Ukraine. You could cut aid to the Ukraine, but you're going to destabilize geopolitical environment inside of Europe. And also, you're going to reduce employment in the United States by those people producing tanks and munitions and other things.
Do you think the average American understands the consequences of presidential policy and how that plays out in their financial lives over time? Or do they just look at snapshots? Here's how I was doing then, and this person was the president, versus here's how I'm doing now, and this person is, or this administration is in charge.
We are living in enclosed silos that we choose that reflect our beliefs back to ourselves. So if you believe the president is doing a bad job on the economy, you find that news source that tells you the president is doing a bad job on the economy. And the same applies in reverse. And the information you consume leads you to believe whether or not presidents actually have the authority they do or not.
So where were we, economically speaking, during COVID, and how has our recovery been?
So pre-COVID, if we look at where the U.S. economy was in 2019 and actually ended in February 2020, it was the longest peacetime expansion in recorded U.S. history. That started under President Obama, finished under President Trump. It actually went from February 2010 to February 2020. Why I believe many people were so shocked by inflation in 21 and 22 was because of the price stability of the previous decade. We grew really accustomed to 2% price growth a year. And when you have stability, you have certainty, and people can plan their lives around it. And when average prices increase from 2% a year to over 9% a year, you're shocked, and you are in an uncertain environment that unsettles people. So there was not zero inflation prior to COVID-19. There was significant deflationary pressures during 2020 But that was accomplished by 1 in 8 Americans being out of work on a temporary basis, which is not exactly good monetary and fiscal policy. Yes, we could lower prices, but if we're having to put, 10 to 12% of the people on the unemployment line, it's probably not the best way to lower prices. So we could look at the claims each president have made. President Trump would claim that there were jobs added in each month of his administration. Entirely true. President Biden can claim that from 2021 forward that we've had consecutive job growth. Every month we've seen jobs added. Also true. President Trump can say, well, most of the jobs that President Biden has been claiming are recovery jobs or bounce back jobs. So President Biden is slightly right and President Trump is slightly right. What we need to recognize is that presidents really don't control job growth. They control, with Congress, the framework within which jobs are created. And they can provide stability or uncertainty. And that is sort of the crux of the argument we're seeing now between Vice President Harris and President Trump. The argument about, are we continued with stability with regards to economic policy, or are we going to see major shifts with regards to, for example, changing the tax structure, changing the tariff structure, and so on.
Candidate Kamala Harris has said that former President Trump wants to impose a sales tax on consumer goods, has been fact-checked as having made a false statement in that regard. But clearly she's talking about his tariffs plan.
It is political messaging to call it that, and understand why. Because if you say tariffs to most consumers, they will say, what's a tariff? How does it work? We have lots of evidence about the impact of tariffs. Tariffs are levied at the port of entry. They are often passed through to American consumers, and they raise prices on American consumers. When a candidate makes a claim that I levy a tariff and the other country pays it, it's not true, because the tariff is paid by the company importing the goods into the United States. So when you say I'm raising billions of revenue from tariffs, you're actually charging taxes on goods being imported. And then the question is, are companies able to pass through those tariffs to American consumers? And it depends upon the good in question. Gasoline, food, etc. Companies can pass those tariffs on almost fully or more than fully to consumers. If you are delivering tariffs on luxury goods, the companies are less able to pass forward those tariffs. But we have enough studies now about the tariffs prior to COVID and previous tariff regimes under Democratic and Republican presidents to unambiguously state is, 1, they cost jobs. 2, they raise prices. Now, let's set that aside. There is an argument to be made that China is playing fast and loose with international trade law, and that we need to be more aggressive in negotiations with China and holding their feet to fire, essentially to either comply with international trade law, but to say we're going to place a 60%, for example, wholesale tariff on all goods imported from China would have devastating impacts upon the U.S. economy. And particularly in Virginia, where the number one trading partner for the Port of Virginia in many months is China. And so if you saw imports and exports to China fall off dramatically, that would directly impact the employees at the Port of Virginia and tax revenue for Virginia.
But the Biden administration did keep in place at least some of the Trump tariffs. Why?
Well, I think administrations are cynical. They will keep in policies that they believe benefit them, while at the same time campaigning against those same policies as something that shouldn't be imposed. And what we've seen in the Biden administration is a recognition that even though these tariffs have increased costs for the U.S. consumers, they have also lowered Chinese imports into the United States, and they believe that's a significant benefit given Chinese trade policies. One argument could be that it's a lever, that we're going to keep these in place until you behave. Now, that's sort of like hitting yourself in the head with a sledgehammer because your neighbor is irritating. But it is a way of sending a signal.
Thank you for watching. Continue to follow Virginia news and stories by subscribing to our VPM YouTube channel.